Very good to see you.
John, how are you?
All right. Hey, we're going to continue our series today of how to dig out of this terrible federal fiscal mess we're in, and reminding the folks out there listening that we need to do way more than get rid of waste, fraud, and abuse. And so far, we've covered load shedding, and we need a cap on spending growth, and you need faster economic growth. And so today, what we need to talk about is perhaps the least pleasant subject of all. We're probably going to have to raise some taxes. So then the question is of which tax and by how much? Your thoughts on that?
Well, I guess my first thought is that going back to our earlier podcast, we were talking about the success of countries in reforming their fiscal systems to address the debt crisis, which is, of course, the key question we're addressing here. And I want to again repeat what we said earlier, that the solution to solving the debt crisis is spending, cutting spending. And there's a lot of research out there now that countries that have been successful in constraining the growth of spending have been successful in solving their debt crisis. Countries that rely on higher taxes have failed. I mean, that's just simply the historical evidence. So having said that, as you say, the question is, what is a tax system that will help us to address the debt crisis and restore some fiscal stability?
Yeah, we need to do some research on that. Surprisingly, there's not much consensus on especially what we call dynamic scoring, namely which tax increases are likely to actually yield the revenue that's forecasted based on what's called static scoring, which means assuming people don't do more or less of what's taxed, which is, of course, absurd for any large tax increase. But that is the law, to score tax increases as if people don't change their behavior as a result of those. And let me just throw some red meat out here for this. Having done a little bit of thinking about this and reading about it, I think until we do the research on these dynamic scoring issues, I think probably the smartest tax to increase would be the carbon tax. And that's simply because of the politics of it. We don't know what we economists call the response function is, namely how much carbon will be reduced. And frankly, we here at IOPA are kind of agnostic on the climate change issue. We don't even know whether that's important for climate change. However, we definitely shouldn't rely on tax increases, as you say, but we were in such a deep hole, we may need tax increases alongside big spend increases, especially early on when the Congress will probably fight the spending increases until it becomes apparent that we have to. So, like I said, I'm throwing out some red meat because this will make some people upset for me to suggest a carbon tax. But since the existing carbon tax is at zero, we're at the bottom of what we call the Laffer curve. And so a small carbon tax would do two things. It would definitely raise some revenue, and it would tell us for future endeavors how much response there is in terms of reduced carbon emissions to such a tax. Your thoughts?
Well, I think the important point there is that people respond to taxes, and that probably the one thing everybody would agree upon is that if you tax something, people will do less of it. If you tax carbon emissions, people will do less of it. But that's true of any type of tax. And I have to express some skepticism of the idea that somehow we can solve the debt crisis by raising any taxes. If you look historically at taxes as a share of GDP in the U.S., it's been pretty stable for like half a century. And that's been under all sorts of different tax systems. And so people respond to higher taxes. So if you tax income, they're going to earn less income and so on. So I think that helps to understand why taxes are so stable. And that is that people make rational responses to higher taxes. And that's why I think tax increases have a very limited potential for solving our problem.
I agree that we definitely shouldn't rely on that to a large extent, but we need to do the research and we need to think through that because the Congress may choose to raise taxes as part of the response that will be required once, to borrow a phrase from Margaret Thatcher, once we really look like we're starting to run out of other people's money and like it'll take more than the Fed being the bond buyer of last resort on a small basis to keep up our payments and to keep our debt funded and not have to default. At some point, we may have to choose between default, inflation, and increasing taxes. And of course, I'm not for increasing taxes, but we need to be ready for that possibility, given that spending cuts are something that people in Congress don't even discuss in any specific way, much less endeavor to do. All the discussions I've heard of spending cuts are, yeah, we're going to reduce waste, fraud, and abuse because everybody agrees on that, at least in concept. And maybe we're going to restore the budget level of a previous year. 2019 is the one that comes up the most because then they don't have to say anything about cutting anything specific. We're at the edge of the fiscal cliff, and so we need to be ready for all the things that can be done to avoid having to print a lot of money and or actually default, which I think is unlikely. The scary possibility, which really is the same as default, is printing a lot of money because then the bond buyers won't lend us any more money. And as we've noted in previous videos, we'll be in deep doo-doo on the national defense front because when the bond buyers will be reluctant to lend us money, what are we going to do when there's a national security crisis? We won't be able to borrow the money quickly to address that.
Well, one that I think the administration actually might be interested in, most of the focus has been now on cutting federal spending, and we know that as that happens, some of these programs are going to be devolved to the states. And the states are going to respond either by eliminating programs or privatizing them or reforming them. The other thing I would like to see is devolution of taxes. That is, I think that we should rely less on the federal taxes and more on state taxes. And I think the reason is that I think the states do a better job of fiscal reform, of balancing their budget, and efficient tax systems that promote economic growth. And I'm speaking from experience. Back in the mid 80s, I helped design our flat rate tax system in Colorado. They came to us at the Independence Institute and they said, we're going to replace our graduated income tax with a flat tax. Tell us what a revenue neutral flat tax is. And I estimated it at 4.25%. They didn't believe me. They set it at 5%. But we did replace a graduated income tax with a flat rate income tax. And since then, we've reduced that several 0.5%, and we've gotten it down to the revenue neutral tax that I estimated 30 years ago. So I think that if we could rely more on the states for both revenue, taxes, and spending, and less on the federal government, we would end up with a more efficient tax system and a tax system that's more conducive to economic growth. When we adopted a flat rate income tax and when we reduced that rate, that created a really good business tax climate. And there's even some discussion, even by our Democratic governor, maybe we should eliminate the income tax since that is the biggest deterrent to work and productivity and economic growth. I don't think that's going to happen, but some states, other states have lowered their income tax, and some states, of course, have no income tax. So I think relying on the states, we'd end up with a much more efficient tax system and a tax system more conducive to economic growth, which would also indirectly help us address our debt problem at the federal level.
Well, that was one of our earlier discussions, namely that part of the solution to the deep hole we're in is increased federalism, both on the spending side, in other words, who does what, and as you say, on the tax side, we should probably rely more on the states to do that, on that note, we should note that Mississippi has decided to phase out its income tax over a relatively long period. So there's another step in the right direction and an indication that, and maybe even a roadmap for Colorado to follow. I think we should cut it
Clearly,
off.
the states,
Oh, go
the
ahead.
states that have the low and or no income taxes are doing much better
They
in
are.
terms of economic growth and improvements in people's incomes and standard of living compared to other states. Of course, the worst states, Illinois and others, they're California and so forth, keep raising their income taxes and other taxes. And not surprisingly, they're losing businesses. People are migrating from California to Colorado, in part because we have a better business tax climate.
That's right. Well, we have one piece of our series remaining out of the 6 parts for our next discussion, and that will be on raising money by selling mineral rights assets, of which the United States has approximately $60 trillion worth. And it's just sort of a prelude to that discussion. We can't afford to do that because we can only sell them once until we have that cap on spending growth. But with that, we'll see you soon.